and welcome to the talk. My name is Peter Sikachev. I'm from Eidos, Montreal, and today I will be talking about real-time fluid simulation in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really humbled to see so many people preferring me to the free alcohol in the room number 5. So without further ado, let's get to the point. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the third game in the series on Lara Croft's new adventures. It just shipped a few weeks ago on September 14 for 3 major platforms. It's a 30 FPS title, meaning we have a 33 millisecond frame budget. It's powered on our in-house engine, which is called CDC or Foundation in different sources. With this title in series, we really wanted to push the visual fidelity further compared to our previous games, and real-time fluid simulation seemed like a very good candidate because it was almost not really used in games previously. And within this talk, I would want to concentrate on the novel and practical things that we did for the fluid simulation, because it's not completely entirely new topic. It was researched a little bit, but it lacked practical implementation in the game. So I will do some short introduction into it, but for more detail on the basic fluid simulation stuff, I would refer you to some other sources like GPU Jam's book series. They were really great in introducing it. Could you raise the hands whoever had time to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider so far? Anybody had time to launch it at all? Okay. Anyway, let's start with a trailer. Open.
Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held, but just ourselves. And immortality. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. The cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than a day.
By taking the key, you set the apocalypse in motion. With this key and the silver box, we can remake the world.
I won't let that happen.
Of many catastrophes you're doing!
Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me.
Rated M for mature.
All right, so before we continue, a short disclaimer. I will be showing some visual materials that do not represent the final game. Particularly, I will be showing some videos taken in the test levels, so don't judge the final game for it. So the talk would be structured in 3 big chunks. First, we will talk about fluid simulation. Then we will talk about how the results were integrated in the game, particularly. And lastly, I would discuss the optimizations and results. So let's start with a simulation. And for the simulation itself, here's the outline, so you can keep track of it. First, I will give some primer on the fluid simulation. Then I will discuss the simulation data flow, which is happening in our engine. Then I would introduce the scrollable grid concept, really like the thing that makes it possible to have it at all. Then I would talk about few stages that are different from the traditional like fluid simulation implementation, including density inflow, obstacle injection, advection, then pressure solver, and finally algae simulation. So let's start with a primer on the fluid simulation. So if you talk about fluid simulation, most of the time you would hear about a so-called Navier-Stokes equation that governs it. It really looks daunting, so that's why we enjoy putting it on the slides. But it's really not that complex as you might see. So we can just take it part by part. So first one, first member you see on the left, it's basically the velocity derivative. Then next to it is the advection term. It means how the properties, including the velocity itself, are moved with a fluid. Then the next is the pressure term, is basically how the velocity is changed due to pressure. On the right side of the equation, the G stands for all the external forces, including gravitation, if it matters, that affect the fluid. And then there is a viscosity term, which actually very often it's not really simulated because it makes computations harder, and because it's easier, as I will show, to simulate viscosity the other way around. And then there is the second equation, which is called Incompressibility Condition, or it's basically what is written there is that the divergence of the of velocity equals to 0. And you can think of the divergence as amount of fluid that goes into the cell and runs out of the cell. So basically, if the amount of fluid that goes into the cell and runs out of the cell is the same, then it's incompressible. So basically, as you might guess, that differential equation, it doesn't have a closed form analytical solution. So in practice, it's usually decomposed into a few steps to solve it. So first, there is an advection approximation, and we use so-called stems advection, where we basically backtrack along the velocity vectors. So then we apply the external forces, basically by simply modifying the velocity by the value of the forces in certain points. Then the most tedious part is that we solve the so-called Poisson pressure equations, and the problem with it is that it's an iterative process, so you have several iterations, and that's usually the most time-consuming part of the fluid simulation. And finally, we do a projection. It's a little bit hard to understand what's going on there, but basically, the way we solve the problem for the fluid that has. As a result, we get a divergent velocity, and what we do there, we basically project it on the on another space to get the non-divergent velocity, and this is done by subtracting the pressure gradient from the divergent velocity. So let's consider the simulation data flow. So basically, Basically, the simulation steps are marked like in white boxes. So first, depending on whether it's first frame or not, we would clear the persistent data, being velocity and density maps. Or if it's not the first frame, we would need to scroll it. I would describe later on what it means exactly. Then we add density inflow and inject obstacles and obstacle velocities. After that, we do the advection for the velocity and for the density. Then we calculate velocity divergence. That's basically like a one-liner. Then we iteratively solve the Poisson pressure equation, and finally we subtract the pressure gradient to get the non-divergent velocity, and that's our result. I would quickly show different maps that we get in the process. So they are basically scaled and biased so that it's visible. So this is how a velocity map would look like in the UV space. This is an obstacle map. So the red dots there stands for the parts of the character that intersect the water. Then this is a velocity divergence, pressure, and pressure gradient. And finally, this is the result that we get. So this is basically our character walking through some murky water with oil. And this is how it looks in motion. And a bit more videos to see how it looks when she swims instead of just walking. So you can notice that the water reacts quite differently. All right. So as you might have noticed, the area on which we simulate is pretty big. So the question is how to, and the resolution is pretty sharp. So the question is how to really achieve that, because performance, as you might expect, really depends on the resolution, because we are running a simulation on the grid. And basically in the game we can have either large water areas or many small water areas, and we wanted to work basically seamlessly on both with good resolution. And the solution to it is actually a scrollable grid. So as you can see on the screenshot, the red areas, they stand for this is our simulation grid. And on the edges of it, in the white areas, it's basically a static. It's basically a static mask. So we run simulation only in the areas near the character, and then we fade in into the areas with a static mask. So this is how it looks. So you can see here that that it blends seamlessly. You don't really see the boundaries of the simulation. Okay, so let's talk about implementation details. So basically here you can see in white, this is our static mask. And then what we can do, we can basically disturb it while moving the character. And then in the red, you can see a close-up of our simulation area. And we basically, only on this area in red, we run the simulation. We crossfade the simulation on the edges to the static map. We snap the simulation area to the world grid, basically, so we can. So basically, we don't have any aliasing or filtering issues. And then finally, each frame we would basically like when the character moves, and when the character moves more than like more than a texel of the simulated map, we would shift all the persistent data, being velocity and density, between the two frames, so that we would keep the results from the previous frames, and we would basically we would have to update the borders that are getting streamed in or streamed out. So here is the listing. Please don't waste your time on reading it right now. I put it there so you can later on, after the lecture, inspect it at your own pace and maybe get inspired by it. So let's talk about density in flow. So why do we need it? If you're basically running any demo with fluid simulation, you would usually just have there some fluid in there, and you can disturb it with your mouse button, etc. But then the real scenario, basically, if you just keep playing with this demo, you would notice that fluid would get homogeneous over the time. So basically, imagine like you have a volume of two fluids, and you start disturbing it, and after some point, let's say you had like red fluid and blue fluid, and after some point they would mix to some like violet fluid, and then it's basically like you wouldn't see any of those beautiful swirls on it, so you wouldn't see anything. So therefore, you need basically some non-homogeneous density to be injected all the time. And it needs to work together with the scrolling, because we need basically when we move, we need basically on the edges that I get it streamed it, and we need to inject it accurately. It needs to be frame rate independent, because basically if we have something happening with our frames, we don't want it to be basically inflowing faster or slower. And second, and the last one, we want the smooth crossfade on the borders. We don't want to see ever the borders of the fluid simulation. So here's the code for the density inflow. I wouldn't go line for line, but I would explain the main concept. So first, what we use is the exponential decay. And why do we use it? It's exactly, we utilize the property of exponent, that if you multiply two exponents, basically the result is an exponent where you add the T1 and T2. And if you look into it, that exactly allows us to have a decay that is frame rate independent, because basically if you skip, imagine if you skip 2 frames, then as a result, and you keep multiplying, and your decay is multiplicative, that would be exactly the same if you multiply twice, like the same amount. And the second thing that you would notice when you start inspecting the code there is that what we do, we basically shift the values on the border towards the values that we fetch from the static mask. So that allows us to basically have always, like, basically always in the on the borders of the mask, we have 1-to-1. It totally matches the static mask, and it smoothly propagates towards the center of the texture, and basically that allows us to never see any discontinuity on the edges, even if we start like moving backwards or running in any weird patterns. So that was like the main trick there. Next, for the obstacle injection, again, if you take the original GPU Gems 3 article, what they did there, they voxelized their characters every frame, and they would inject this voxelized representation of obstacles and velocity into the fluid simulation. But this is impractical because voxelization is pretty expensive, and besides, in the real game scenario, we have something better. We basically have our collision mesh, and what we do, we reuse the character collision capsules that we have and we intersect them basically with a plane, with a fluid plane. So that allows us to handle up to basically 32 NPC. You can handle more, but it's just like for the practical reasons we didn't need more than that. We store those collision capsules in a hash table by character ID. So basically, we need that to keep track of the capsules that started intersecting or ended intersecting on particular frames to basically to derive the velocity. And yeah, as I said, we inject the intersection of capsules into the simulation. Next, the advection step. So basically, I will go over differences in our advection with the traditional fluid advection. So we have a longer shader here because in order to save the bandwidth and avoid unnecessary ping-ponging between render targets, we perform several operations. So apart from just advecting the things, we add the velocity inflow. Basically, we can have like a static map, like a flow map, for instance, that would affect all the velocity. So we do it here. And second, we add viscosity. And our viscosity is not physically based because, as I mentioned before, it makes solving the equation much harder. And really, like for the velocity, you don't really notice it. So what we do, it's pretty simple. We again reuse the same concept of the exponential decay for the velocity. And then the other thing, which was basically what the FX artists asked for us, was to have different viscosities for two fluids that we have. So we have there like water viscosity and oil viscosity, and you can basically set them up to have more interesting effects. So let's get to the Poisson pressure Jacobi solver. So as I mentioned, this is really like a simulation bottleneck, because what you need to do, you need to solve a system of linear equations, and unfortunately, if you solve them iteratively, then you can have an analytical solution. You can have like basically use a Gauss method, but if you want to solve them in parallel, there is no analytical solution. So you need to go for an iterative approach, and that's what it makes it hard. And as you could expect, it is bandwidth bound. The problem, because we're basically not doing so many hard ALU operations, but we're fetching a lot of data. And then how do we optimize it? By prefetching the bigger areas of pressure and obstacles to the local data storage from VRM. And then we use gather instruction to basically to reduce the fetch count. And the gather instruction, it allows you to fetch 4 samples as if you were doing a bilinear filtering, and it's surprisingly very effective. So basically, we need 5 samples to calculate our kernel. And we can cover it only with the 2 gathering instructions. So we're fetching like 8 texels. So we're wasting, normally if we don't do like this LDS prefetch, we're wasting like 3 out of 8 texels, and we still outperform as if we were fetching those 5 texels separately. So it's really, really powerful. I recommend using it. And we store all transient textures, basically not density and velocity, in ESRAM. I mean, if you do any Xbox One programming, you know what I mean. It's basically like you have to use and abuse it at all time. Otherwise, like the bandwidth is really hard to get the good bandwidth. So again, this is the shader for Poisson pressure solver that you can study later on in your spare time. And I will go to the last topic in the simulation, which is algae rendering. So basically, after we shipped the oil simulation, our department came to us and said that, hey, we'd really want to use it for algae. And I immediately freaked out because algae is not really a great candidate for the fluid simulation, because algae, if you think about it, it's a compressible fluid, because basically when you walk through an algae area, it could clump together, so that would correspond basically to compressing it. And then Navier-Stokes equation doesn't really work directly, and you may basically, to get a proof of concept, imagine like a swamp that is covered uniformly in algae. And then if you walk through it and if you use the standard Navier-Stokes simulation, you wouldn't see anything because it would be all uniform, and you need like two fluids to have it mixed. But fortunately, there is something in the research literature on it. And originally, this method was used for sand simulation, which had the same issue. And one of the approach that proved to be interesting is called PIC, or particle in cell. So the idea behind it is basically that, well, first, like I need to diverge a little bit. There are two ways of doing the fluid simulation: Eulerian and Lagrangian. So one way is that you treat that the fluid is all composed from the particles, and then you simulate all particles independent, all points as if they were particles, and then there are some interactions between them. And second approach that we used here, obviously, is that you treat this fluid as it's like as it is a grid with some properties in each cell, and you basically cannot handpick any particle, and rather than you have basically some values defined at each point, like density and stuff like that. So the particle and cell approach, it's sort of a mix between the two, and the idea behind it is that you run your grid simulation, but at the beginning of each frame, you take your density and you convert it to what I call virtual particles. Then you do the advection for those particles. Basically, you use your velocity field to advect them. Then you splat those vertical particles back to density, and then rest of the pipeline stays the same. So here you can see the part of the pipeline that really changes. And basically you can still utilize and take benefit from the grid simulation you had before. So this is what it looks like. So you can see the algae density map here, and we utilize exactly same concept of the scrollable grid for it. And this is what it looks in game. So you can see then when the character moves through algae, she's really pushing it, and basically there is some it's clumping like on the edges of the simulation, and you wouldn't have this effect if you were just running exactly the same simulation you ran for oil and water. So here is the code for the shaders. They're really simple. The particle density resolution shader, it's really like a one-liner. So I would stop for a moment to explain what's happening here, and there are two things. First, we basically, what we do, we quantize the density into the integer format. And why I do that, you can realize like from this last line here, because I use atomic operations to accumulate density. And unfortunately, in the shader model 5.0, which is the standard for DirectX 11, you can run atomic operations only on integer values. So therefore, what we do effectively is that we quantize everything into integers, and then we basically after we do the advection, we add together, add all particles that hit in the same cell together. The other thing which you can notice here, we have this particle grid multiplier. So basically, what we do some sort of super resolution for the particles. So in each grid cell, we spawn basically 4 particles to avoid like aliasing issues. And the final command that I need to do is that interlocked atomic operations, they might go really wrong. But as a matter of fact, we really have not that much of racing, because most of the time you would be each particle would be hitting like I don't know, 80% of the time those would be like unique cells, and you don't have that much of the race for incrementing something. So really, for Algae, when we measured the performance, it yielded to exactly the same results as for the oil, because the bottleneck is elsewhere. Next, let's talk about engine integration. So CDC basically it's a component has a component-based architecture as many modern engines. And besides, it's a multi-threaded engine. So we have a main thread and then at least a rendering thread. Well, this is what we need to care about in this context. And how it works basically is we have our instances, or you may call them entities, and they have a list of components. And the way we organize things is that you can add a fluid component to any instance, and then we will have a fluid component manager that would basically store all the fluid components. And basically, fluid component manager, it is responsible for 2 things. Each frame will select a closest component. Basically, it's the component to whose boundaries the character would be the closest. And then second, it would create a so-called drawable, compute drawable that would be pushed to the rendering thread. And then when the rendering thread is, when the drawables are flushed on the rendering thread, it would call the draw function, which would do all the things. Well, it would run the simulation, so it's a little bit misleading because we don't actually draw anything here. But the idea with a drawable is drawable basically consists, it contains all the states that you need to render on another thread, and it's basically a thread safe, like a thread safe entity. Next thing, basically we integrate it with a material system by creating a fluid mask node. So in CDC we have a node-based shader material system. So basically what this fluid mask node does, here is the code for it. So it fetches the density and velocity maps that we got from the simulation, and it outputs density, velocity, and pressure gradient through those outputs. As an input, it gets the UV offset and the static mask. So basically, you need to feed the exact static mask to the simulation and to this fluid mask node. Then a little bit on the shading details. So we had those 2 big things: the oil simulation and the algae simulation. So for the basically fluid mask is used to interpolate between two materials, being it water and oil or water and algae. And for oil, we use an iridescence mask, and is governed by thickness, by basically oil thickness or density, and the Fresnel factor. Here's what the iridescence mask look like. And then for algae, we use a special high frequency mask to break the pattern. So it basically acts as a multiplier for the values that we get from the simulation to add some grainy feel to it. Finally, let's talk about the optimization and results. So I talked already about how we optimize the Poisson pressure, but we had few more things on our plate. So first was managing many obstacles. So basically, when you have multiple characters in the fluid simulation, you basically if you start evaluating each collision primitive in each grid cell for the fluid simulation, it can be really tedious. So we basically use a tiled approach. It's exactly analogous to tiled lighting. So we basically we just on CPU we evaluate which tiles, 32 by 32 tiles, are intersected by which capsules, and then we create, for each tile, we create a list of the capsules that we need to evaluate. And small implementation detail, we use a structured buffer instead of constant buffer because of the storage limitations to store that. And then next for algae, next we use Async Compute. That is a great candidate for Async Compute because first, it doesn't depend at all on the graphics side, so we don't even need a depth buffer or anything. So we can kick it very early in the frame. Second. Then basically it's bandwidth bound, so it really parallelizes well with things like shadow mapping. Then it's used late in the frame because water is basically rendered after all solid objects, so we have a lot of time for it to run. And basically, we kick it on a very low priority async compute pipe, and then we insert a fence at the end of the simulation, and we wait on this fence basically before starting the water, the water rendering. So we, in case our frame was too short, we ensure that we don't get corrupted results. Basically a usual scenario when you use async compute. So for the results, we ended up with a method that allows the vast area support, so we can support basically infinite amount of water with scrollable textures. We came up with a method for practical viscosity because it's much easier to evaluate than what you can find in the research papers. Then we have a method for frame-independent viscosity and inflow by utilizing this nice property of the exponents. We came out with a method for algae simulation, which doesn't work out of the box for Navier-Stokes equation, and we use a concept of basically compressible fluid and particle in cell based approach. And last, speaking of the performance, it runs half millisecond the simulation on the 256 by 256 grid for the Xbox One, and this is a timing that you can get if you run it on the graphics pipe and basically on the async compute pipe you might get it for free. Because if it parallelizes well with some other features, but this is like a worst case basically estimation. And finally, let me show what it looks in the actual game level. And I wanted to discuss few things that I would like to see on future. So with this work, we basically proved that 2D fluid simulation could be used effectively on the current gen platforms. But in future, of course, it would be nice to see the 3D simulation for effects such as like fire or smoke running in real time. So maybe we can get realistic participating media in the end. And to make it feasible, we already, in most of the engines, we use Froxel volumetric fog. And to make the rendering part feasible, maybe we can think of injecting it into volumetric fog grid to sort of have rendering for free. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge some of the people who contributed to this work. I worked with a number of very talented FX artists and graphics programmers on it, and of course the whole Eidos and Crystal Dynamics team for making this talk possible here. The mandatory hiring slides. So if you want to come to Montreal, it's a great city. We have the best weather, like 10 months of a great weather, and the rest too, you cannot play hockey. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now. If you're too shy, there are my email address and social networks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for such interesting report. I think that I definitely will be rewatching it one more time, especially digging into code snippets. My question is about scrollable grid region and grid nature. Is it uniform square one, or use some kind of adaptive approach which will be more dense to the obstacle itself?
Mm-hmm. We use just the uniform grid, basically. I don't think that, I mentioned the hierarchical grid, but I think in our situation it wouldn't be too practical. I think because basically you care about fluid simulation only in our case we cared about it close to the main character, because you don't see much like far away. But I think the hierarchical grids would be more interesting for the 3D case, because they would also match very well, like the Froxel volume approach. So in our case, it didn't seem practical, and we didn't want to make it more complex and to basically to run several simulations at the time, because the budget was really limited. But I think, as I said, for the 3D simulation, that would make much more sense.
Thank you.
More questions? No? Well, thank you, Peter.
That's it. Thank you so much for coming.